In this section, we'll look at how the Kennedy administration did in its domestic policy, how successful the New Frontier was. I should say that at the beginning, the New Frontier was popular and began with a lot of enthusiasm, but it faced real problems. The unemployment rate was almost 7% when Kennedy came in office, and in his first year, the Speaker of the House, Sam Rayburn from Texas, a long-time, very tough disciplinarian, died, and what ended up happening was there was less discipline in House voting. There was less cajoling to get the legislators to pull the party line, and this hampered Kennedy's ability to get bills passed. JFK's liberal New Frontier faced some problems because some of the conservative Southern Democrats joined with Republicans to block some of Kennedy's initiatives. For example, a group of over 100 conservative Democrats helped defeat JFK's school aid bill. He had proposed federal grants for 3 years of $2.3 billion for states to build new schools and raise teacher pay, and another $3.3 billion for student scholarships. But the defeat in the House was in part due to the fact that Kennedy had refused to include parochial schools, Catholic schools. Obviously, he didn't want to be accused of favoring his own faith. But anyway, the church therefore lobbied against the bill and hurt it. Also, they defeated JFK-backed bill to provide a health insurance for the elderly, which he called Medicare. They slashed his request for foreign aid, about 33% less. And even though Kennedy had spoken of the challenge to go to the moon in a decade and back, they slashed 10% from his request for NASA's space program. They weakened his programs, his proposals for for funding for mass transit, and they killed his proposal for a Department of Urban Affairs. So Kennedy had some problems in his domestic New Frontier program. With unemployment a little bit too high, Kennedy decided that he was going to push for some tax cuts, and he proposed dropping the rates from the highest rates, income tax rates, from 91% to 65%, and the corporate rates from 52% to 47%. He immediately ran into problems with people who were worried about deficits. Kennedy was clearly sort of embracing Keynesian economics, but what we see is that the legislation really didn't pass until 1964, when they dropped the highest income tax rates to 70%. In recent years, Republicans have claimed that Kennedy was embracing supply-side economics. In reality, one must consider the tax cuts in context. Today's highest income tax rates are in the mid-30s. They were, again, 91% when Kennedy came into office. And also, he was acting more of a Keynesian than a supply-sider. This is not to say that the New Frontier was unsuccessful or that liberals were completely alienated from JFK. JFK's New Frontier did have some successes. For example, in 1961, he signed the Housing Act, which authorized nearly $5 billion for local urban renewal projects over a 4-year period. In 1961, Kennedy got the Area Redevelopment Act passed, which provided for nearly $400 million in federal loans and grants for assistance to so-called distressed areas of economic stagnation and high unemployment. In 1962, Kennedy signed the Trade Expansion Act, pleasing many free market advocates. It was designed to develop closer ties to the new European Common Market, and it reduced tariffs by 50% and up to 100% on certain products where common market nations in the U.S. conducted almost all of the world trade in that product. The act promised, quote, trade adjustment assistance to aid American firms and workers adversely affected by the lower tariffs, pleasing the liberals there. It's not really a liberal bill. It had bipartisan support, but it probably ranks as one of JFK's greatest legislative accomplishments, and looking back, many people associated with some of the economic growth that followed. With the economy modernizing and technology replacing many more manual laborers, Kennedy signed the Manpower Development and Retraining Act of 1962. It authorized over $400 million for 3 years to assess manpower needs changing because of the new technology, and then sort of retrain those laid off in the technologies that were then the new economy needed. Strenuous administration efforts also mustered a major victory for a higher minimum wage. The new law, which went into effect in September 1961, raised the hourly minimum wage in two stages over a 2-year period, from $1 to $1.25 for the 24 million workers who were already covered, and it also extended the same coverage to some 3.6 million new workers, primarily in retail and service industries. Up until the 1960s, Americans had always looked at the natural resources as something to be developed. There were, of course, preservationists all the way back to Teddy Roosevelt's day, but the majority of people assumed that development of natural resources was good. In 1963, a wildlife biologist working for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Rachel Carson, published a book called Silent Spring, and in it documented the problem of pesticides like DDT and its impact in the ecology. And many people have cited this best-selling book as the beginning of American environmentalism. People began to realize that perhaps constant development was not always good. Kennedy was all for development, but there was also some evidence that he was open to this new environmentalism. For one, he named as Secretary of Interior Stuart Udall, who was a famous and outspoken advocate of natural beauty, and indeed he wrote a book called The Quiet Crisis, which talked about the problem of environmental quality eroding. In reaction to Rachel Carson's Silent Spring book, Kennedy pushed his Science Advisory Committee to investigate the claims. They later upheld some of the conclusions of Rachel Carson's book, although their report was overshadowed by Kennedy's death. Kennedy did increase funding for waste treatment centers, and he signed the Clean Air Act of 1963, which was the first time the nation really spoke of controlling air pollution, the federal government controlling air pollution. It established a program in the Health, Education, and Welfare Department for the government to issue injunctions on air polluters. In reality, it didn't have much importance because it required states to initiate the proceedings and not the federal government, and the states were often leery of upsetting businesses that might go to other states, so not much came of it. Yet it was a significant, if not sort of a symbolic move towards protection of the air. JFK could also get tough on business, as noted in his relations with the steel industry in 1962. Now, JFK was worried about labor-business relations in general. He was afraid that if the union demanded higher wages, that the companies would then raise prices, and it would fuel inflation. But he was pleased when the steel companies and the United Steelworkers Union reached a 2-year contract agreement that while it raised wages, it would not cause inflation, Kennedy assumed. But after the agreement, U.S. Steel Company announced that they were raising their prices by $6 a ton, and then 5 other major companies announced the identical increase the next day. The JFK was really hacked off, seeing the move as unjustified and fueling inflation. He said, "I'm shocked that a tiny handful of steel executives, whose pursuit of private power and profit exceeds their sense of public responsibility, can show such utter contempt for the interest of 185 million Americans." So JFK really went after the steel companies. He got the government to do everything it could. He got the Treasury Department to threaten tax investigations. He got the Justice Department to announce that it would investigate to see if any antitrust laws were violated. He got the Defense Department to hint that it would buy steel from companies that didn't raise rates. Of course, the Defense Department was one of the biggest customers of the steel industry. And he got the Federal Trade Commission to announce an investigation into price fixing. All this pressure ultimately worked. The steel companies backed down on their price increase. And while the whole episode annoyed business executives around the country, most Americans saw it as a forceful action on behalf of the people against the greedy wealthy. Certainly the liberals applauded it. This includes the section on Kennedy's domestic New Frontier program.